A black man driving a luxury car becomes the target of a prejudiced cop who's determined to make an arrest. Little does he know, his actions will backfire when the man reveals he's the state's attorney general. Follow the story and comment where you're watching from. It was a sunny afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina, and Officer Mark Stevens was patrolling the streets, as he did every day. Mark, a seasoned cop with over 15 years on the force, prided himself on his instincts. He believed he could size someone up with just one glance. Driving through a quiet neighborhood, Mark's eyes locked on a black SUV parked near a coffee shop. The driver, a black man in his early 40s, sat inside, scrolling through his phone. He wore a crisp white shirt, a navy tie, and gold cufflinks that glinted in the sunlight. To Mark, the scene didn't sit right. He thought the man looked out of place. Without hesitation, Mark pulled his patrol car behind the SUV, flipping on his lights. The man in the SUV looked up, surprised but calm. He rolled down his window as Mark approached. "License and registration," Mark said sharply, not bothering with pleasantries. The man nodded, reaching into his glove compartment and pulling out the documents. "Sure thing, officer. Is there a problem?" His tone was polite, but firm. Mark glanced at the license. The name read Jonathan Brooks. He barely processed it before snapping back, "What are you doing here? This isn't exactly your part of town." Jonathan raised an eyebrow but didn't react. "I'm grabbing a coffee before heading to a meeting downtown." Mark didn't buy it. To him, Jonathan's confidence was suspicious. He leaned closer, peering into the car. "Mind stepping out for a moment?" Jonathan hesitated, then sighed. "I don't see why that's necessary, but all right." He opened the door and stepped out, standing tall. Mark gestured toward the curb. "Stand over there." Jonathan complied, keeping his composure. Mark began searching the SUV without asking for permission, rifling through the center console and back seat. "You know," Jonathan said calmly, watching Mark rummage through his things, "you're supposed to have a warrant for this." Mark shot him a glare. "I don't need you telling me how to do my job." After several minutes of searching and finding nothing, Mark grew frustrated. He decided to escalate. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Jonathan frowned, his patience wearing thin. "For what exactly?" "Obstruction of justice," Mark replied curtly, pulling out his handcuffs. Jonathan didn't resist as Mark cuffed him. A small group of onlookers began to gather, some recording the scene on their phones. Jonathan glanced at them but remained calm. As Mark led him to the patrol car, Jonathan spoke evenly. "You're making a mistake, officer." Mark smirked. "We'll see about that." Inside the station, Jonathan was placed in a holding cell. Mark felt a sense of satisfaction, convinced he'd stopped someone up to no good. Meanwhile, Jonathan sat quietly, his demeanor steady. He wasn't angry, he was calculating. He knew the law better than most and understood exactly how this would play out. Mark began filling out paperwork, his confidence unwavering. To him, this was just another routine arrest. But in just a few hours, he would realize how wrong he was. Hours later, Jonathan was escorted to an interrogation room. The small, dimly lit space was silent except for the sound of the door clicking shut. Mark entered, carrying a file and wearing his usual smug expression. He sat across from Jonathan, leaning back in his chair. "So, Mr. Brooks," Mark began, his tone dripping with condescension. "You want to tell me what you were really doing in that car?" Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but firm. "I already told you. I was on my way to a meeting downtown. You, however, have yet to explain why I'm here." Mark smirked. "You think you're clever, don't you? People like you always think you can talk your way out of trouble." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "People like me? Care to elaborate?" Mark's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You know what I mean." Jonathan sat back, folding his hands. "I do. And so will the court." Mark's confidence wavered slightly, but he pushed on. "You've got quite the attitude for someone in cuffs. Maybe it's time you stop pretending to be something you're not." Before Jonathan could respond, the door swung open. A senior officer, Captain Harris, stepped in, his face tense. "Mark, we need to talk." "No." Mark frowned but followed Harris into the hallway. "What is it?" he asked, annoyed. Harris's voice was low but firm. "Do you know who you just arrested?" Mark rolled his eyes. "Yeah, some guy who thinks he's above the law." Harris's expression darkened. "That guy is Jonathan Brooks. He's the Attorney General of this state." Mark froze, the color draining from his face. "You're kidding." "I'm not," Harris said sharply. "And he's got every right to sue us for wrongful arrest, illegal search, and racial profiling. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" Mark swallowed hard, his arrogance replaced with panic. "What do I do?" "Apologize. Release him. And pray this doesn't cost you your badge," Harris snapped before walking away. Back in the interrogation room, Jonathan waited patiently. When Mark returned, his demeanor was completely different. He avoided eye contact, fumbling with the keys to Jonathan's cuffs. "Mr. Brooks," Mark began, his voice unsteady, "there's been a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Jonathan stood, rubbing his wrists. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone calm but pointed. "That's one way to put it." Mark stammered, I didn't realize who you were." Jonathan cut him off. "And that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't care who I was. You saw a black man in a nice car and assumed I didn't belong. That's why I'm here." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice steady and authoritative. "You don't need to worry about my title or who I am. What you should be concerned about is how many others you've treated like this. People who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back." Mark looked down, unable to meet Jonathan's gaze. Jonathan turned toward the door but paused before leaving. "I'll see you in court, Officer Stevens. Not for me, but for everyone who's been in my position." Outside the station, a crowd of reporters had gathered, their cameras flashing as Jonathan stepped out. He addressed them with the same calm confidence he had shown throughout the ordeal. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "This is about a system that allows bias to go unchecked. We need accountability. Not just for individual officers, but for the entire structure that enables this behavior." The story quickly went viral, sparking outrage and conversations about systemic racism in law enforcement. Jonathan filed a lawsuit, ensuring Mark's actions would be thoroughly investigated. For Mark, the fallout was swift. An internal review led to his suspension, and his reputation was shattered. He became a symbol of the very issues Jonathan had spent his career fighting against. For Jonathan, the incident became a rallying point. He used the platform to push for reforms, speaking at town halls and working with lawmakers to implement mandatory training programs for officers. In the end, it wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about challenging a system that had gone unchallenged for far too long, and proving that justice, when wielded by the right hands, could be a powerful force for change.